Hey, 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 everybody. It's time for our next unit. This is Unit 8, second to last unit, on aquatic and terrestrial pollution. It's kind of a big unit, covers a lot of different topics, but we'll talk about the different types of pollutants that we produce, how they impact the ecosystems around us, both land and in water, what we can do to address those problems, and the overall impacts that those pollutions will have not only on our own health as humans, but on the health of the organisms and ecosystems around us as well. It's a bit of a long unit and it's a bit varied, so I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what we'll talk about. We'll start today by talking about the pollution, basics of pollution, and then we'll jump into aquatic pollution, looking at eutrophication, sewage treatment, impacts on different ecosystems like coral reefs and mangroves. And then when we come back from break, we'll talk a little bit about chemical toxicity, how chemical pollutants impact individual organisms. And then we'll switch to terrestrial pollution, looking at solid waste, hazardous waste, different solutions to our trash problem in the world, and recycling, things like that, composting. And lastly, we'll close off with a discussion of human health and pollution and connection to diseases. So with that in mind, let's jump right into the basics of pollution. We've been talking about air pollution. Terrestrial and water pollution is a little bit different, but it revolves around the same idea that we have this waste byproduct that comes from some sort of system or process that is totally useless. Only humans can really produce waste. Only humans produce things like plastic that, once used up, don't have any further purpose. Their life cycle, quote unquote, ends when they end up in the landfill. Right? It's not like poop or something, which will biodegrade and return nutrients to the soil. These will just be around forever. And waste is a major component of pollution. Pollutants can come from two different types of sources. A point source is a single identifiable spot where pollution is coming from that we can track to a specific location, like an exhaust pipe or a smokestack, as opposed to a non-point source, like this bottom picture here, where there's a broader area with a bunch of different sources of pollution that are all gathering. A great example is a watershed, where you've got runoff from suburban and urban areas, you've got runoff from agricultural areas, forests, and also industrial areas. That's all going to end up in the river. Where is the main location of that pollution? Well, there isn't really one. Coming from a lot of different sources. So that is what we qualify as a non-point source. Pollutants can also be, tend to group them into different categories. Physical pollutants are things like trash and sediment. Biological pollutants are things like diseases, bacteria, virus, fungi, etc. And chemical pollutants, which is what we're going to spend most of our time on, are things like petroleum, pesticides, heavy metals, etc. Well, let's talk about physical pollution. We've already talked about thermal pollution, but let's talk a little bit about trash and sediment. So trash is probably the first thing you think of when you think of pollution, and it ends up in our landfills, and it also ends up in the ocean. I'm sure you've heard of the Pacific Garbage Patch, which isn't really a patch so much as it is a soup, but the rivers in both China and the United States carry lots of trash, and it ends up in the Pacific, and the ocean gyres kind of circulate it around and keep it trapped in this area. Like I said, it's not really a patch. The whole thing kind of looks like this. Thousands and thousands of pieces of plastic that slowly break down. Very ugly. If animals eat it, it can block their intestines, make it difficult for them to breathe. It fills up their stomach, so they don't eat because they think they're full, but they're not actually getting any nutrients, so they starve. And over time, as they break down, they can release toxic chemicals into the water, which can have detrimental impacts on the health of the organisms. Another example of physical pollution is sedimentation, whether it's sedimentation built up behind a dam or runoff leading to erosion from development of residential areas along the coast or farming. That runoff can carry lots of clay, silt, and sand into the water and make it very, very turbid. Lots of particulates floating in the water is going to make it less clear. And that's a problem for predators because it's going to be difficult for them to see their prey. And it's also going to be a problem for photosynthesizers, primary producers that rely on the sun to produce energy. So the turbidity can have pretty significant impacts on ecosystems in that way. Biological pollutants are things like viruses and diseases. I don't want to talk about those quite yet. I want to kind of put them in their own little category a little bit later on towards the end of the unit. So just put a pin in that for now, and we'll get to that later. Chemical pollutants are what I want to spend most of our time on. Chemical pollutants, there are a variety of different examples that we've talked about so far this year. Great example are heavy metals. We've been talking about those since we started talking about mining. Things like arsenic, lead, cadmium, mercury. It doesn't take much to pollute a lake or an aquatic ecosystem. And they often result from mining and the combustion of fossil fuels. If they can seep into the groundwater aquifers, they can contaminate our drinking water. And if they don't seep into the ground, instead they run off into surface waters, they can build up in aquatic ecosystems and cause some pretty serious harm. So here's some mercury being released from fossil fuel combustion, and either through atmospheric deposition or just through runoff, it can end up in these aquatic ecosystems. It builds up inside these organisms' tissues, and then we eat those organisms and we get mercury poisoning. That's why one of the reasons they say to avoid eating too much tuna. We'll talk about that a little bit later this week. Another example of a chemical pollutant is petroleum. We've talked about oil spills, but we didn't really get into the details of how they harm organisms. They can coat the fur and feathers, making it difficult for them to stay warm and regulate their temperature, but also to fly or to swim. It can smother and suffocate them. If the hydrocarbons in the petroleum sink to the bottom, it can even affect the organisms on the seafloor, benthic organisms. It can blind and immobilize, and it also has indirect impacts on the fishing and the tourism industry. So these are two examples of chemical pollutants, heavy metals and petroleum. We'll talk about a few more as the course of the week goes on, but I want to dive a little bit deeper as to how these can affect living things, how chemical pollutants affect organisms. And we've really already talked about it, and it's something called ecological tolerance, a topic we introduced early in the year and has been relevant the rest of the year. So for those of you who need reminding, there's an optimal range of conditions that an organism thrives in terms of temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, other abiotic factors. If, say, the temperature gets too high, it's going to be difficult for organisms to survive. If it gets too low, outside their range of tolerance, same thing. It's going to be difficult for them to survive. Why? It's difficult for them to regulate their functioning of their body. It might induce stress. It might lower their growth rates, their ability to reproduce, to lay eggs, to give birth, and it might even cause death. So ecological tolerance is a pretty important topic that you've got to keep in mind throughout the course of this unit, because exposure to different chemical pollutants could put an organism outside their range of ecological tolerance. Another thing chemical pollutants can do is they can disrupt the endocrine system in organisms. Those of you who don't know, the endocrine system is the hormonal system in our body. There are a variety of organs that contribute to the hormonal system in our body, such as your gonads, but also your thyroid glands, your pancreas. Common hormones that you may have heard of are testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, adrenaline, etc. And all sorts of chemical pollutants like hydrocarbons, like VOCs, like pesticides, flame retardants, etc. can mess with your endocrine system and cause a hormonal imbalance. And hormonal imbalances can be pretty detrimental, leading to things like birth defects, developmental disorders, neurological damage, imbalances with gender. And the way that these hormone or endocrine disruptors work is they can either mimic the hormone and cause an extra response. So they might mimic testosterone and boost the testosterone's impact, or they might block testosterone and cancel its effect. So just keep that in mind going forward. When we think about ecological tolerance and the impacts of chemical pollutants, we also want to remember the idea of an indicator species, which is an organism that can give us some clues about how healthy and how safe an ecosystem is. For example, the mayfly nymph, which lives in freshwater streams, is very, very sensitive to pollution. So if you have mayfly nymphs in your water, then you know it's pretty clean. But if you don't have them in there, you know it may be as experiencing some pollution levels. Frogs and amphibians are another great indicator species because they have very porous and permeable skin. Another great example is fecal coliform bacteria. If you find that in your water, then guess what? You just might have fecal waste contamination, either from human sewage or from animal feedlots where they're dumping their sewage into the water. Great example of fecal coliform bacteria you've probably heard of is E. coli. So this is another example of an indicator species. Luckily, we have lots of legislation that helps protect our water from chemical pollutants. The Clean Water Act protects surface waters. It sets standards for pollutant levels. It mostly focuses on point source pollutants. It helps maintain wetland ecosystems and preserve their biodiversity and their health. And it funds research into sewage treatment, wastewater treatment as well. Another important piece of legislation is the Safe Drinking Water Act, which regulates the water pollution, but not of surface waters, of groundwater, aquifers. It sets drinking standards across the nation that states have to enforce. It looks at 77 different contaminants, including things like heavy metals and petroleum, but also bacterial pathogens and such. Something interesting to note is that groundwater pollution from fracking is not included in this act. You can thank Dick Cheney in 2005 for that. Another important law that we haven't talked about is called CERCLA, or the Superfund Act. CERCLA stands for Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. Now, Superfund site, these are dots representing all the Superfund sites around the country. A Superfund site is basically an abandoned facility where there is large amounts of deposited hazardous waste that needs to be cleaned up. So what this act does is it taxes the industries that produce those Superfund sites, produce large amounts of hazardous waste, and the act also funds a cleanup of those abandoned waste sites, which is really important. There are a bunch in Connecticut, a lot in New England, a lot in New Jersey around Newark as well. Unfortunately, as effective as this and important as this act is, it has a checkered past of environmental racism and environmental injustice, with delayed responses to hazardous waste cleanups for communities of color, most notably Black communities and Native American communities. One example is the Church Rock uranium mine in New Mexico. There's large amounts of uranium being deposited into the communities there, and the government had a significantly delayed response in cleaning that up. And also in Warren County, North Carolina, North Carolina, which is a predominantly Black community. In the 80s, industries were dumping these chemical pollutants called PCBs, which we'll talk about next week. These are endocrine disruptors, and again, the government not only took a very long time to come and clean up, but there was also significant pushback against the communities who were protesting that. Okay, and now it's time. The moment you've all been waiting for, the moment you just can't resist. I know you know what's about to happen, and I know you're quivering in your seat. You just can't hold it in, and it is time to talk about the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. You've been talking about it all year despite not knowing what it's all about, and now it's finally time to actually talk about it. Now that's what I call legislation, baby. So, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It governs the disposal, storage, generation, transportation, removal of solid and hazardous wastes. Things like batteries, bleach, rat poison, old motor oil, old light bulbs, various insecticides and bleach, things like that, all sorts of cleaners. And that helps protect our water sources from chemical pollutants. So these are all examples of legislation that play important roles in regulating chemical pollutants of water sources. The Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, the Superfund Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. They all do something a little bit different, but they're all important. Something to keep in mind is that clean water is not something that everybody enjoys. We have it great in the U.S. Almost everybody has access to clean water in the United States, but that's not true around the world. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of people don't have access to clean drinking water. Many of them lack proper sanitation as well, which only feeds into levels of pollution, particularly biological pollution and spreading of disease. Those numbers are even worse in sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the developing countries are. And if you remember from our unit on populations, women in these developing countries can spend most of their time gathering water, up to 6 hours a day, which means they don't have time for an education, which means they start to have babies early on in life, which impacts the total fertility rate. So having clean water is something that we take for granted in the United States, but can have huge impacts on the lifestyle and empowerment of individuals, as well as the population growth rate. So if we can help these countries get access to clean water, we're going to help slow the population growth rate, which is good for all of our resource consumption around the world. Okay, and that's all I've got for you for now. If you've got